Hi folks, Dr. Caddy back again, and today I want to discuss with you the writing process, or writing as a process. And one of the reasons I make this distinction is because writing can be just a process, guys. And when I say just a process in quotes, right, just, that means that it's as simple as any other process that you might perhaps use for yourself. For example, when we cook, if we don't necessarily know the recipe for making whatever it is that we want to make, what do? We follow a recipe, a written recipe, otherwise known as a cooking process, and we start with step 1 and move to the end, step 10 or whatever, and hopefully out will pop whatever we want to cook. Okay? We buy a piece of furniture from a store. Okay? And if we're not a carpenter, or we're not like used to and or good at putting things together, okay, what do? We pull out the process, otherwise known as the instructions, right? The assembly instructions. Back in the day before GPS, you had to ask directions, write them down, use a map, God forbid. Even with GPS, I suppose, we need directions to get someplace, and those directions are a process, right? We start at the beginning, we work through, and we come out at the end. And so is writing as a process as well, okay? And in this particular process, the whole idea is that it's based on the idea that most people in America, outside of academia, let's say, don't like to read as much as in academia, okay? And maybe a lot of that has to do with the fact that in academia we have to read. Okay? It's part of what we do. And of those people who like to read, even fewer of them like to write. Okay? And writing, especially, for example, in academia, i.e. our class, is not necessarily going to be writing that we're going to be psyched up to do or geared to do. Okay? Very few of us actually will want to do the writings that we have to do. Not necessarily because you don't like to write per se, but because usually when you're given a topic to write and you don't have a choice beyond a few, it becomes a little bit more of a burden than a pleasurable, if you will, activity. Okay? So the idea of using a process for writing in here, any class actually, is to have something that you can turn to that can enable you to do what you need to do, the assignment, and when you need to do it, the deadline, okay, with no worries about, I don't feel like doing it, I'm not in the mood to do it, oh gosh, I have to write this paper and it's due, and oh, I don't want to do it. If you follow a process, okay, hopefully we can get it to the point where it's as mechanical as possible. In other words, you start at the beginning of the process, you work your way through, and out pops what you need to have pop. Just like the recipe, instructions, directions, any process that you can think of. That's the idea. Okay? So our definition ties right in with that, and it's boiling writing down to an objective process so that within a preset framework or purpose, you can write to task and on demand, no muse or inspiration required. Okay? And you see our goal down here is on task and on time. We need to have what we need to have when we need to have it. Okay? If we turn in perfect copy and it's 2 days late, we didn't meet the goal, right? If we turn an imperfect copy and it's right on time, again, we didn't meet the goal. We have to have both come together, on task and on time. Now, I said a word in here that we've all heard a million times, but I want to look at that word a little closer. Okay? And that word is objective. Right? And when we say an objective process, okay, we're talking about a process that is objective, or removed, if you will. Okay? When you think of the word objective and its antonym subjective, all right, Subjective generally has to do with the subject, or in my case, if I were saying it, myself. Okay? So if I were writing something that was subjective, I would probably write it in the first person. I, me, my, we, our. Right? I did this, I did that. Because I'm telling you something from my perspective, the subjective perspective. Okay. Objective is more of a factual type of perspective. When I use the first person, okay, or the subjective business, okay, it lends itself very easily to opinions, okay, which is why you'll see once we get past the first bit of writing that we're going to do, which is in first person, the next two things that we write, you won't be able to use first person because we want a solid argument. And to make that solid argument, we want to use facts as much as possible. Facts, examples, anecdotes. Things that are hard to argue. Okay? If I were to ask you, hey, how do you feel in this room? What temperature-wise? Are you warm? Are you cool? Are you comfortable? And you were to say, well, I'm kind of warm. And then I were to look back at you and say, no, you're not. That's silly. How can I tell what you're feeling? And the answer is I can't. It's subjective, right? Just like I may be feeling cool, and that person might be comfortable, and that person warm, and that person cool, etc., etc. It's subjective. That's a very simplified explanation of it, but it gets the point across. Objective would be not necessarily how the air in the room makes you feel, but the fact that there's air in the room, period. Okay? And how do we know that? Well, we're breathing. We're alive. And we know that we need air to breathe, and we need to breathe to be alive. Since we're all alive and conscious, we can assume that there's air in here. So you really can't argue that. Okay? You can argue how the air makes you feel, though. Right? And it's that feel that this wants to eliminate. Notice how it says, no muse or inspiration required. Substitute the word feeling. Okay? You don't have to feel like it to get it done if you follow an objective process. Because in an objective process, it's not, do I feel like doing this? Okay, I'll do this. How about this one? Do I feel like doing this? Nah, not really. Let's do it later, blah, blah. And you see what happens there. You procrastinate. Okay? But if I'm following the objective process, now all of a sudden, it doesn't matter how I feel because there's number one. Number one is whatever it is. Number two is whatever it is. I don't have to worry about it. I can just go down to the next line, see what it says, and follow the numbers on down to the end. And theoretically, of course, that leads to one task and one time. Okay. Now, one of the important pieces here are the keys to the writing process. And some of you will hear me say this many, many times, especially if you take me for Comp 2 as well. And if you're listening to this and you have Comp 2, then you know what I'm talking about, okay? The keys to the writing process, purpose and audience, why and who, okay? Why? In other words, what is the purpose? What are you writing, okay? What's the purpose? Is it persuasive? Is it informative? Is it just to give me examples? Okay? Name your type of essay and that will fit the purpose. Our purpose for the first essay is exemplification, where you will give me examples from your own life. Okay. Audience. Audience is very important. Who are you writing it for? In our case, it's simplified to me. Okay. So you don't have to worry about, will he understand what I'm saying? Is this too much? Is it too little? Do I have to simplify it? Do I have to sharpen it up a little bit? Okay. You can assume, for the sake of argument, that I know what you're talking about. Now, we could change that, okay? We could keep the same purpose and change the audience, and it would make the whole difference in what and how you're writing. For example, let's say I wanted to torture myself and write a paper about quantum physics, which I'm fascinated by, but I have absolutely no, beyond a very, very fundamental understanding of it, okay? So I want to write this paper about quantum physics, okay? And let's say I want to write it, who's my audience? Okay, well, I'm writing it for a group of 5th graders, who have, no grasp of quantum physics. Okay? So when I write my paper, okay, I need to make sure that I'm using language that a fifth grader can understand. If I say a term that's too complex, I need to break that term down. Okay? And et cetera, et cetera. So my paper is inclined to be a little bit longer because I can't simplify things. I have to explain it in more detail because my audience won't understand it if I do it in technical terms above their heads. Okay. What happens when you're sitting at a lecture or a discussion and the lecturer makes comments and such that are over your head, that you have no idea what they're talking about? Generally speaking, we zone out, don't we? Get bored. And what happens when we get bored? We don't pay attention. Of course, when we don't pay attention, we miss things. So it's important for the speaker/writer to make sure they know who their audience is. Now, if I take that same paper on quantum physics, okay, now instead of fifth graders, I'm giving it a symposium to a group of quantum physicists. First of all, I'm going to be in trouble because I don't know what I'm talking about. But as a writer, okay, now I can use complex terms and I can assume that they'll know what that means because of their background. I know enough about my audience to know that they'll know what, for example, quantum entanglement means. Okay? Whereas a fifth grader might not, I'd have to explain it. But a quantum physicist would. So my language would be different. My tone would be different. Okay? And generally speaking, it would probably be a little smaller because I wouldn't have to go into vast detail on some of the salient points. Okay? Think about that with a recipe. Okay? If you're making something and you're following the cooking process, i.e. a recipe, all right? You look at that recipe, first you're going to glance over the ingredients that you need, then you're going to glance over the actual instructions, and you're going to make sure that you understand what it says, okay? Because if you don't have the in-depth knowledge enough to know what the instruction says, you're not going to be able to follow it, all right? So you have different levels perhaps, all right? If you already know how to cook and you're a good cook, maybe you're a chef, all right? I don't have to explain much to you. I can say, hey, cook this, and you'll be good. But if you're less experienced, i.e. me, okay, I might have to explain it in more detail. Okay? Same thing goes with the instructions or the directions. Okay? A fun exercise to try to see if you're hitting your audience is pretend that you're talking to an alien and you're trying to explain how a relationship works. I don't know if anybody knows that, but say you're doing that, okay? You couldn't explain it really like a human because it's not a human you're talking to, and they might not know any of the terms that you're going to use. So you'd have to break it down to the smallest elements, to the least common denominator, so to speak. The thing that everybody understands, which could be very basic. Okay? You have to know your audience, guys. Okay? This is very important, and hopefully with that explanation you kind of get the idea as to why it's very important. Okay. Now, let us look further. If I can get my cursor to work. There we go. Okay. So, this process that you see right here at the top of the board happens to be an 8-step process. Okay. You can clearly see 8 steps, and some of them are broken down into other steps. Excuse me. But overall, it's an 8-step process. Okay? Planning, research, drafting, writing, revising, editing, proofing, and formatting. All right? It happens to be 8 steps. If you already have a process in place, you don't necessarily have to use this one, right? You already have one. As long as you have something that works for you, it's fine. Okay? This is 8 steps because I'm breaking it out so you can see all the little pieces. Your process may be 5 steps or 4. Maybe it's 12. Maybe it's 20. Maybe it's 2. The key to that is if it works. Remember the keys: on task and on time. If it does the on task and the on time thing, it's a good process. means okay. It's a good process. All right. And as you can see, you can group these together. The first three together, you see the dotted lines there. The first three together are the pre-writing steps. The next one is the writing. It sits by itself. Then you have these two, which make up the content edit. And then you have these two, which make up the mechanical edit. Okay? So let's look and see what each of these has in store for the aspiring writer. Okay? So planning, the first step, planning. Okay? Now, guys, this can be as formal or as informal as you need it to be. All right? Again, the keys, the goals, on task and on time. For our purposes in here, whatever it takes for you to achieve that is perfect. Yeah, okay. All right? That means that, again, like I said, whatever size process you have, whatever you need or whatever works for you is a good one. All right? Unless you are specifically asked for a piece of it, you don't really have to worry necessarily that you have all these parts or not, as long as you achieved the purpose, okay? What you're supposed to do, the goal, right? And when you're supposed to do it, okay? So the planning actually can begin the second you hear that we have an essay due, right? And it can be as informal as you sitting in your seat on day one thinking, oh man, we have an essay, I'm not good at writing essays, blah, blah. You know, wherever your thought goes, okay? I wonder what this could be about. Let me look at these topics and you see. So you start planning in your head. It's not formal, right? You didn't write anything down, okay? On the other hand, maybe you did write it down. Maybe you are that person who needs to write everything down. That was me in school. Okay? I wrote it down or I forgot. Okay? So don't feel bad if you have to write everything down. It's good. At least you're doing something so you don't forget. If you don't need to do it, don't do it if it works for you, okay? So you're thinking about the essay. What do we have to do? So I open up the announcement to that one announcement where I broke out the first assignment in simplistic terms, at least the draft part. And I said that you had to pick one of the topics, okay? How do you feel about that? And then back it up with support from your own life, examples from your own life, okay? So as you see that, you start thinking to yourself, oh, okay, there's a topic that says art is subjective, some art can be ugly. Yeah, I like that, I agree with that. My friend has a painting of blah, 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 and everybody in the family loves it except me. I think it's horrendous, I don't even know why it can be hanging on the wall. That kind of thing. Most commonly, you can apply that to music. If you think about music, people love certain groups or singers or whatever. Other people don't. So in that case, you can give examples of, from the subjective point of view. Okay. But what are you doing? Okay, you're thinking about it, planning, and you're starting to research it because you're starting to try to come up with examples, which is, in this case, exactly what you need to back up your side, so to speak. Okay, how do you feel about the point that you've selected? So you're actually engaged in your head in research, and that's where this research is for this assignment, okay? This is not one you're going to have to go to the internet and look stuff up. Okay? This is the kind of thing that you're getting in your own head, all right? An exemplification essay. Those examples aren't going to be found on the internet, they're going to be found in your head. Okay? So most of that part is informal. Now, as you think of it, you might want to jot it down so that you don't forget it and have to think of it again later. That's a pain in the butt. Okay? So you could potentially write it down. Okay? And then the third step, the drafting, this is where you will start to put your ideas together. Okay? And again, this does not necessarily mean you're actually writing it down formally at this point. You could be. You could also be thinking in your head, okay, I got that example, I need another one, come up with another one. And then you look at the description of the assignment in the lessons folder, and you see how to put it together. Okay, so the beginning has to look like this, the middle part is the body, and it has to contain this, and then the end, the conclusion has to have this. So here, and you're thinking, here's how I would do this. I would introduce my topic, then I would launch into my first example, my second example, and then my conclusion, which would be just a restatement of my intro. You're thinking. You're not necessarily writing it down yet. You're doing this. You're cobbling together a draft, if you will. And as you get more and more satisfied with what you come up with, either ideas or structure, all right, you might want to jot it down, just again, so you don't forget. If you're the person who doesn't forget anything, move on, okay? But for everyone else, you might want to write it down. Now we have a step that sits by itself, number 4, and that is writing. This is the part where you're getting it out of your head and into something that you can save permanently, like a computer, for example. All right. So, the hardest part, guys, about any of this stuff, whether you have a process or not, okay? I know students who have great ideas, they're ready to go, they have all their information, they sit down at the computer, they're staring at that blank screen, and they're like, yeah, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to start. That's very legitimate, guys. Most people have a problem with starting. Okay? Whether you're a seasoned pro, Stephen King, Anne Rice, or a student who's writing their first essay, everybody has problems with starting, guys. Okay? Myself included. So much so that we have come up with all of these pre-writing techniques to help us, right? Pre meaning before, and writing, before writing. Okay? These are things we do to try to get our mind into what we are writing. Okay? To try to focus, if you will. All right? And not all of them are necessarily straightforward, and not all of them work for everybody. What might work for you might not work for me, and vice versa. Okay? So again, this is another thing that if you're having an issue with and you want to look into pre-writing techniques, you can Google this and you'll find a million of them. These are just a few, literally just a few, of the more popular ones. Okay? That doesn't mean any of them are going to work for you. You might find some obscure pre-writing technique that works like a charm for you. Use it. That's great. Unless you're specifically asked, like I said before, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you meet the goal of